Well, Parliament will decide today if the Constitution should be amended. The 18th Amendment, if passed, will allow for land expropriation without compensation. 3 years ago, the National Assembly adopted a report recommending that the Constitution be changed in this regard. Today marks the final step in that process. Well, any amendment to the Constitution requires a two-thirds majority. A number of opposition parties have already said they will not support the bill. Well, to explain the implications of the amendment, if passed, I'm joined now by Wilmien Wicomb, a lawyer from the Legal Resources Centre. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a long road to get here. I think it's about 2 years. And if I remember correctly from the public participation and the debates in Parliament, the ANC and EFF have been at odds over the bill. The EFF wanting the state to be the custodian of all land in the country, and the ANC saying no, only parts of pockets of land should be owned by the state.
That is correct, and that became the sticking point towards the end of the process. But I think it is important to note that the process was about considering whether the Constitution must be amended to allow for expropriation without compensation. So the issue of custodianship really went way beyond the mandate of this committee, and there was real concern to introduce such a far-reaching concept, in particular because it was clear that the different parties, certainly the EFF and the ANC, had very different understandings of what custodianship would mean. But yes, indeed, in the end, the ANC, in their final draft amendment bill, proposed that the wording suggests that circumstances must be created in order to enable state custodianship of certain pieces of land. And it's really quite unclear what that means. But the EFF was not happy.
Wilmien, this has been on the agenda of the National Legislature for the past 2 years. There needs to be a two-thirds majority in order for it to be adopted and sent to the National Council of Provinces. How likely is that to happen today?
It looks very unlikely. We know that the DA and the Freedom Front Plus, they've indicated that while they participated in the process, they were from the start really opposed to any amendment. So the wild card, of course, is the EFF. They walked out of proceedings towards the end. They were not willing even to adopt the report that will be tabled in the National Assembly. But you never know. It may well be that they decide to change their minds today, but it seems highly unlikely that this will be passed.
So the ANC would need the EFF to join with it in a vote to get a two-thirds. What if it isn't adopted? What happens then?
Well, so with this bill, you know, that's the end of the road. It won't go to the NCOP. But I think what's very important to understand is that, you know, a constitutional amendment is of course important. In this case, the implications were not going to be that great because most legal opinions suggest that the Constitution already provides for expropriation without compensation. The key issue is legislation, because that is what enables expropriation without compensation. And so the expropriation bill has been in Parliament, different versions for more than a decade. We still have one from the 1970s. So that's the critical piece of legislation, and that hopefully will be passed next year, because that's really the mechanism that's needed, much more than a constitutional amendment.
Wilmien, am I correct in understanding that the section of the Constitution that allows for appropriation without compensation is actually in place, but there are exceptional circumstances and it would have to go through a legal recourse, if you like, in order for that to happen? So there is that mechanism in place.
So the Constitution currently provides for just and equitable compensation. And our courts have traditionally really interpreted this as meaning market value, or at least market value as a starting point. Whereas, you know, for years, many lawyers have argued that in many circumstances, just and equitable compensation would be nil, would be nothing. and therefore it's always been possible in terms of the Constitution. It's just never been used. A big part of that because we don't have proper legislation that would guide government into how to do expropriation with or without compensation.
Wilmien, one of the arguments the ANC made is why that mechanism hasn't been working is that they haven't been able to compete with market-related prices for property, and so they haven't been able to pay for the land that they wanted for state resources, for instance, such as to build a school or whatever it is. And that's one of the issues that's been preventing them from buying private property and converting it into state-owned land.
So, in as far as that has been a prohibitive factor, it was based on a policy from the ANC itself. You know, the willing buyer, willing seller kind of policy. That's not in the Constitution. The Constitution has never been the stumbling block. Although, having said that, I think our courts have mostly been really traditional and conservative, I should say, on this point, and has, not been supportive of lower rates of compensation. And so in that regard, an amendment to the Constitution may well have been useful in at least clarifying that certainly compensation can be nil, just an equitable compensation. But in as far as the ANC thinks that their hands were tied, I think that's incorrect.
Wilmien, very quickly before I let you go, I remember the ANC explaining during the public hearings that it wasn't going to be a case of, the state can just take any land they want. They were really looking for big stretches of land. They weren't looking to take people's homes and kick them out of their houses, such as they did in apartheid at District 6.
Yes, I think what people should remember is that expropriation, is not land grabbing. Expropriation is a highly regulated legal process in terms of the expropriation legislation, which is why it's so important. So, there are multiple legal steps that need to be followed, and at multiple points in the process, it can be challenged, and courts will oversee it. So, the idea that people will just suddenly be kicked out of their houses or kicked off their land, that's really some scaremongering. That's not what expropriation is. And I think what people also don't know is that we've always had expropriation. Our current legislation is from the 70s. Almost all countries in the world provide for expropriation. It's not something new or novel. And the debate is really kind of distorted, I think, many people's understanding of what expropriation is.
It really has, and I think the markets and rating agencies need to understand that too. Thank you so much for joining us, Wilmien. That was lawyer Wilmien Wicomb from the Legal Resources Centre.